Now, good evening, all of you wonderful third years. I hope you're all well. Um, Welcome to our first weekly Junior Cycle English class. A couple of things before we get going. The class starts at 8, as you know, because it's 8 o'clock, and it's scheduled 8 to 9. But don't worry, I'm not going to keep I'm not going to keep you every week for an hour torture. I know you're probably on because your mum or dad wants you to be on, but hopefully this will be of some use to you. So we'll go up till about 20 to quarter to each evening. And then the key thing will be you can see there's a chat open. And I'll just actually put a little message into the chat. I think if I don't put the first message in, it doesn't function. So I'll do that really quickly. So as we go through the class, if you have any questions on what I say, or even like towards the end, if you have any kind of general questions about things that I haven't done, in that particular week, just throw it into the chat. And then in those last kind of 10, 15, 20 minutes, I'll just deal with those questions as we go along. Okay. So look, the crucial thing is this, right? Your mocks are coming up. Your junior cycle is about 4 months away. All I'm trying to do here is give you some insights that might help you get prepared. This is not a magic bullet. It's not, the magic formula to transform you from, whatever it is that you are averaging in the 60s to, try to get up over those 75s or whatever. It's about looking at English work and trying to understand the material and then the types of questions to expect and the types of answers that are rewarded. That's the work. So I'm going to get straight into it, no preamble, okay? How can I put this? Okay, so you're talking to each other, you're not talking to me. That's all right. Okay, so let's show you a couple of things first. That poem is called, well, it says it there, Dulce et Decorum. And I'm going to deal with that poem tonight because I had a request to deal with that poem tonight. And that's the way I want this to work. I've been teaching junior cycle English, well, junior cert English and junior cycle English since the 90s. Like that's a very long time ago. So I could come on every evening and I could, teach a class and show you many, 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 many different past questions and, insights into plays and poems and so on. But I want you to drive this class. So I received information today, thanks to the wonderful Rachel. Hello, Rachel, if you're on, that there's quite a number of you out there who are preparing this poem and who honestly don't have a bold notion what the poem is about, and you're a bit worried. So I'm going to go and have a look at this poem and explain this poem to you in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Now, just before I do that, what I'd like to do is explain to you why. Okay, I'm not going to get into the whole why you study poetry. I love poetry. I think it has, value studying it. Most of you don't think that. So let's think about from the point of view of an exam, why we study poetry. So I'm going to show you 3 things. The first thing is last year's junior cycle exam, the official one. And I want to bring you to page, and again, you don't have this in front of you, don't worry, but if you have your past papers, but you don't need it. I'm going to go to page 24 and I'm going to show you this question. Okay? Somebody's having a problem with logging in. Again, I have no power over that, okay? So here is last year's exam. And the question, the prompt was, interesting interactions create interesting poems. Now, I'm going to just mark something here really quickly. And don't worry, you don't need to have this in front of you. If you haven't got your past papers, I'm going to go to the document that you'll need to have in front of you in a couple of minutes. But it says, choose a poem, so only one poem, you have studied where the poet captures an interesting interaction between people and the world, or between people and the world around them. Okay? So between people or between people and the world around them. You have to give the name, you have to give the title, and the section is worth 20 marks. So not a huge amount of marks, okay? You had to, the easy question was describe the interaction, and then the second part, and always look for the second part, was a language part, describe one poetic technique that the poet uses to make it an interesting interaction. So that's the most recent exam. Poetry came up last year. Remember, there's no guarantee that poetry, fiction, film, drama will all come up on any given year. 3 of them will likely come up. Poetry tends to come up a lot. So what it's saying is pick a poem and be able to describe what happens in the poem for 10 marks, and then be able to talk about a technique that the poet uses which you find is interesting. So that's last year's exam. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to close that, go back to Dulce, and I'm going to write the words, the key words from that question at the top of the page. Now, this document that you have in front of you, this document that's on the screen here, yes, no, admin, fair play to you, admin. Admin's a great help. I presume that's Ronan. Hello, Ronan. If you look at the chat, it says the notes for this class can be downloaded on the news feed. So this document is on the news feed on the platform in a PDF form. And you can go into that news feed and click that and download it if you want to, or you can just watch along here. Just watch along. It's all good, okay? So that question asked about interesting interactions. I'm just going to write those words here. Apologies for my terrible handwriting. Between people or the world around them. And it also asked about one technique that the writer used to create, to make the poem interesting. Okay, so remember, when you're looking at poetry, you're always thinking about, okay, what kind of questions can I expect to be asked? So when I'm preparing a poem, I know exactly what I need to prepare. Do I need to learn every line in the poem? No. Do I need to learn a poem off by heart? Absolutely not. Unless you have come from one of those families where your parents love to, embarrass their children on Christmas Day and make you do a party piece still. You need to stand up and recite a poem. But unless your teacher is one of those people who wants you to recite poetry in class, which I think has a value in itself. For the exam, you don't need to learn a whole poem. What you have to be is targeted. So here, what's happening in the poem and technique. Now, so that's last year's exam. Let's very quickly look at two more exams. So this is last year's mock exam. We're in the mock season at the moment. Okay. So again, as I said a moment ago, guys, the papers I'm showing you, you don't need them. I'm just showing you questions, okay? So don't worry, you don't need these papers in front of you. I'm just showing them to you, and then we're going to get down to the poem for the purposes of making it clear to you the types of questions that are asked. So this is the 2024 mock, and the poetry question, and this was on page 23. Again, you don't need it. Just look at the screen and you'll be fine. And there is the question, okay? This time again, it was worth 20 marks on the mock last year. And it was, select a poem you have studied in which the poet communicates. This time, wasn't an interesting interaction. It was a powerful message. So that's going to be my keywords I'm going to write down as well. And what message does the poet communicate? So that's, again, a very simple question. That's part A. And then part B, outline at least two poetic techniques. There's that word again. It says at least two used by the poet that you would emphasize while reading the poem aloud, and that was just the format. So we're looking for techniques. So if you don't, when you're preparing your studied poem, the message here from these two questions is you need to have techniques employed by the poet prepared. You need to be able to explain what those techniques are and have quotation ready, which will illustrate the use of those techniques. And you need to be able to explain the effect of those techniques. So that's, when we're doing poetry, we have to have that ready. That's basic stuff. So that's the 2024 mock. Okay. And then we go to the 2023 mock very, very quickly. And this one was on page 7. This is really easy. So here we go. Another question. Simon Armitage aims to get readers or listeners of the poem to have an emotional connection with this poem. Choose a poem you've studied that you have an emotional connection to. Okay. Describe, again, just describe, very simple language. Describe the emotion you experience reading the poem. And then look, discuss the language and imagery in the poem. And again, the techniques that a poet uses to create language and imagery, that's what's being examined. So, three different papers that have studied poetry questions. All of those papers only require you to talk about one poem, talking about interesting interactions, talking about powerful messages, and talking about emotional response and technique. So now let's go and look at Dulce et Decorum Est. I'll just write those other terms on the page here so we don't forget. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I'm going to read the poem. I'm sure many of you have read it. I'm sure many of you have read the poem before. And I'm hoping that the work I'm going to do now is just going to reinforce what you already know. And if I do that, then that has value in it. There might be some of you who've studied this poem and it was last year and you forgot it. So this is revision. So there's value in that. There might be some of you whose teachers read poems and then tell you to write the poem out and then tell you to learn lines without explaining what the bloody thing is about or why you're learning the lines. So hopefully this will be of help to you as well. Now, okay. I'm just looking through the chat there. Just give me a second. Susan, do I know what's on the English mocks? I'll deal with that at the end of the class. Yeah, so it's all technical stuff. That's fine. Thank you, admin, for looking after all these people. Okay, so let's have a look at this poem. Now, the poem is called Dulce, and I'm just going to walk through it now. Don't worry. The poem is called Dulce et Decorum est. Now, I mentioned that title to somebody earlier on today, and they said, what language is that? So the first thing you have to know is that is a phrase that's in Latin. And what you have to know is that the poet Wilfred Owen, he lived in Britain during the period of the Empire, and he grew up at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So we're talking early 20th century. Now, why am I mentioning when and where he's from? Because in order to understand this poem, you've got to understand the cultural context of the poem. And that means, what kind of world did he live in? He lived in a world which was extremely nationalistic. Britain, at the time that Wilfred Owen was growing up, so the 1890s into the first decade of the 20th century and the 2010s, Wilfred Owen grew up at a time when Britain had an empire which controlled fully 1/6 of all the land on earth. So it was a massive empire. And so young British boys in schools were encouraged to develop a love for country and a devotion to service, so that when they grew up and Britain needed them to go and fight in the empire, they would go and fight. So they were told things like Dulce et Decorum est. Now, what does Dulce et Decorum est mean? Okay, now I'm going to go to the second page of the document, and you'll see here the translation of the phrase that Wilfred Owen was taught in school, and the full phrase is Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori. Okay, now, see the word patria? You might recognize that word. That word means fatherland or country. Patriotism or patriotism means love of your country, but it comes from the Latin for fatherland. So patria is your country. Mori means to die. And dulce means sweet. So Wilfred Owen and young people like Wilfred Owen, his generation of people, and not just in Britain, but in Germany, in France, all over Europe, at this period of nationalism, were taught it is sweet and honourable to die for your country. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. And of course, being young and being trusting and being naive and believing that their elders who were telling them these things were telling them the truth, these young people swallowed this message whole. And what happened was, when war broke out in Europe following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in the end of July 1914, when war broke out the following month in 1914, all of those young people, or many of those young people, certainly Wilfred Owen, ran to the recruiting offices and joined the army. Why did they go join the army? Because they thought the army was going to be fun. They were going to wear lovely uniforms and look handsome, and they were going to march through the streets, and women were going to swoon, and they were going to go off and be heroes for the empire. And when they came home, people would celebrate and laud them. They were sold a lie that war is glamorous and even to die for your country is sweet and honourable, that in the glory of military death there is value. And they went to war and they found out the truth. And this poem is designed by Wilfred Owen as and I'm going to introduce you to I'm going to try and introduce you some kind of higher order vocabulary here. This poem is a polemic. Polemic. And that means, think about the word, the phrase politics. That means of the people. A polemic piece of writing is a piece of writing with a political message. And this poem is an anti-war poem. And that is why it is important to note that the title of the poem is bitterly ironic. Wilfred Owen and his generation were taught Dulce et Decorum est, pro patria mori, and they went to war and they found out that that was a lie. So instead of this poem being a celebration of war, this poem condemns war. Instead of this poem being a poem which encourages people to follow the truth, or sorry, the myth that war is glorious and sweet, this poem sets out to make the point that there's nothing beautiful, nothing sweet, nothing honourable about war. War is horrible, painful, and involves a huge amount of suffering. So, how does Owen communicate that? He communicates that, guys, through the magic and power of his language. I'm going to just walk you through the marking here. SIM, I presume you know, that's shorthand for simile. And as you know, a simile is a comparison, a direct comparison using like or as, which helps the audience or the reader understand the point, or which helps the writer convey the point to the reader. It often creates imagery, and we'll talk about what imagery now is in a second, okay? When you see I've written down met, you know that means metaphor. And a metaphor is a use of symbol. Okay, it's a symbol. It's like an emblem. It's an idea that it's a use of words that represents a complex or difficult idea. And again, I'll explain what that means as we go through and show you. I see there was a question in the chat there from Danielle. How many poetic devices should you have prepared? And I see Japnit and Amrita replied at least 2. At least 2 is ideal. For me, when you're going into the exam, I would have, for each poem you're preparing, and I would prepare no more than 3 poems. If you have 3 poems prepared, you're unlikely to be using 2 of them. You're most likely to be asked on 1, but there is precedent for them to ask you on 3. With the 3 poems you're preparing, have a quote per poem for 3 separate techniques. So that's 9 quotes for studied poetry. That's all you need. Now, if you know more than that, my name is Paul and I'm happy. I'm delighted if you're well prepared and you have more than you need, but your bare minimum is 3 quotes, and each quote should illustrate a technique, and each quote should allow you to talk about the meaning of the poem. Down here, you'll see I say O-N-O-M, and O-N-O-M, I know you know already, but I'm going to presume you don't, is short for onomatopoeia, and onomatopoeia is a technique, which writers use to add substance to their imagery because it appeals to the aural sense, to our sense of hearing. Onomatopoeic words recreate sounds, and that adds a depth to the imagery. Okay, so that's the shorthand, the marking. Now, I'm going to go and read the poem, and then hopefully you'll understand what's important about the poem. You'll see down here, I have written the phrase iambic pentameter. You do not need to learn that, although I like to educate students, and I think really good English students tend to be able to blend in information. I'm not going to get into the great detail of what an iamb is. It's simply a pair of syllables. A meter is a planned rhythm or beat in a poem. And I'm sure you were told this by your teacher in school. Well, Danielle, everything that I'm going to do in these classes is designed to help you prepare for your junior cycle exam. And therefore, everything I'm going to do in every one of these classes will be useful to you in your mock exams as well. Can I tell you which mock you're sitting? Have I seen the mocks? Yes, I have. Are there mock papers where there are a few difficult questions? If there were no difficult questions on a mock exam, it wouldn't be a very good exam. Does poetry come up in every mock exam I've seen? No. There are I've seen 3 mock exams. 2 of them have a studied poetry question, one of them doesn't. You don't know whether there's going to be a question in your studied film, your studied novel, your studied play, or your studied poetry. That's why your job is to have all 4 of those ready, and then you don't have to stress about what's coming up in the exam. Now, so let's go. Oh, sorry, the meter. Now, listen, look at the first line. I'm going to do it. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks. How many beats? 10. Look at the next line. Knock need. Coughing like hags, we curse through sludge. How many beats? 10. Till on the haunting flares, we turned our backs. 10. And towards, now this one, toward our distant rest began to trudge. So each line has 10 syllables or 5 pairs of syllables. You know that pent means 5 and iamb is a pair of syllables. So when a poet writes an iambic pentameter, he or she gives each line 10 syllabic beats, and that creates rhythm, and that is something which makes the poem easier to read aloud. It's a technique employed by poets that makes the poem flow. Maybe you don't think it's interesting. You don't have to write about it. You can wipe it straight out of your brain right now if you want to, but I'm going to try and show you these things as we go through. Now, the poem features in the first stanza, are you ready to write this down? A cinematic description of a battlefield scene. The scene is described in vivid detail, and the word I'd really love you to think about when we're looking at this poem is the word visceral. So you know that vivid means powerful. You know that. You know if you read a line and suddenly, just from reading the words, you can see it, that's vivid. Visceral means it's vivid and it's uncomfortable. It's unpleasant. You don't like looking at it because it describes something ugly. And what we see in this opening stanza is a description of great suffering. Young men who went and joined the army because they thought it was going to be a great adventure, and they were lied to and told, Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori. Go off and join the army, be a hero. And look at them here. They are bent double, like old beggars under sacks. Now you can see them. They're hunched over. They're not standing up straight. They're not strong. They're not powerful. Their experience of being at war has doubled them over. They're exhausted. They're tired. There's nothing heroic about this scene. Knock need. I wonder, did your teacher explain to you what that means? That means that they're physically exhausted, so that they feel on the edge of collapse. That's what knock need means. And by the way, knock need is an example of a compound word. And this is evidence of the writer's, compound adjective. And this is evidence of the writer's inventive language. Coughing like hags. A hag is an old woman. Coughing is onomatopoeic. When we say the word coughing, we can hear the sound. So the writer is painting a picture, but it's not just a picture with oils. It's a picture in a cinematic way, because we can see things, but we can also hear things. He's appealing to our senses. These men are exhausted. They're only young men, but they're like old hags. They're cursing. They're fed up. They're exhausted. They're tired. They're afraid. The ground is sludge, mud. Till on the haunting flares we turned our backs. Now, that's the first really brilliant image in the whole poem. And it's a symbol. See that there? It's a symbol. Okay. I'm going to stop for a second now, and I'm going to deal with something here, okay? Leon, yes, I can absolutely, because I teach Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I'm not going to teach individual movies, but I will show you sample answers in which I use Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse to answer questions. That is going to happen in the coming weeks. Now, so Susan asked, do you think the mocks are hard? And Emma says, yes, they are really hard. Most people fail, but then the actual junior cert is easier. Okay, so I don't know you guys, and you don't know me. So I want to be very clear with you. You will hear loads of nonsense spoken around the mocks. People older than you will tell you stuff that's nonsense. So I'm delighted to be here to read that question and to read that reply so I can tell you the truth. I've been doing this. Look at me. I had hair when I started doing this. I've been doing this a really long time. The mocks are designed to mirror the difficulty levels of the junior cycle exam. Every mock exam and every junior cycle exam are of parallel difficulty. Every mock exam will have easy sections, and every mock exam will have trickier sections designed to filter out the students who are of different levels. So maybe only the students who are distinction level will be able to deal with specific questions well. Don't worry about the mocks being full of very difficult exams. Worry about getting prepared and worry about learning the skills of the English student. There's no magic fairies going to come and sprinkle dust on your head and suddenly turn you into the best student in the world. You have to do the work. And part of the work is learning what to prepare for the exam. And then I'll show you how to use that to write answers. I'm already looking at the clock here. So look at that, haunting and flare. So let's take the word flare. And in this sense, he's talking about a burst of light, a flare like a firework, like a burst of light, okay? Now, on a battlefield, there are lots of flares, lots of bursts of light. So a flare is a thing, and you know that a person, place, or thing, that's a noun, okay? You also know that a word that describes a noun, like haunting, even though haunting is a verb, it's been used here as an adjective. That adjective noun combination tells us something about the place that the men are. It is a place where there are ghosts. And he doesn't mean ghosts as in the supernatural. He means it's a place where there's death. And every time you see a flare down the line when you're in a battlefield in the First World War, that's an explosion and somebody has died. So the writer is talking about how these kids, these young men, who remember, were told, fight for your country, Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori, you'll be a hero. They ran off to join and they got the reality. And the reality was being bent double with exhaustion, to have your body and your health broken down till you're coughing like hags, to be surrounded by death and the haunting flares and the knowledge that the next bomb might come and get you. The writer is deliberately showing in a vivid and visceral way, using metaphor, that's a metaphor, and simile and onomatopoeia, these are all techniques, how awful his experience was. He then says, men marched asleep, many had lost their boots. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. You can hear the beat and the rhythm in the line. It's meter, but it's also alliteration. You see the M. Now, why have I got metaphor written there? They weren't asleep. They're not sleepwalking. He's trying to capture how exhausted they are. They don't get sleep. How could you sleep in this place? There are explosions, there's death, there's fear everywhere. So they're so tired that they're exhausted and they're walking with their brains switched off. And that becomes important in the second stanza. He then says, many had lost their boots. He doesn't mean, hey, Billy, yeah? Where's me boots? I put them down and I can't find them. That's not what he means. He means that they weren't given the correct equipment by the people who sent them to war. He means they were given boots that weren't suited for the type of warfare that they were engaged in, and they rotted off their feet. So they're not only exhausted and their bodies are breaking down, coughing, and they're bent double, but they're also, their feet, they haven't got the equipment, and they're barefoot and their feet are cut to pieces. And he captures that in the brilliant metaphor when he says, but limped on bloodshot. Now again, what is that? Look again. Bloodshots. Remember I said knock need? See the hyphen being used there to join the words together? He's a clever writer, Wilfred Owen. A clever writer. Now, you have to understand what shod means. So shod is the past tense of the verb to shoe. To shoe means to put a covering on a foot. He is saying that their feet are bloodshot. Does that mean they're wearing boots made of blood? No. It means that their feet, which have no boots, because the boots rotted off them in the wet and the mud, their feet are cut to ribbons. They're in physical agony, these guys. Why does he create this image for us of bloodied feet? I mean, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Why does he create this image of these young men limping along? And he says it there, look at limping along. Lame means limping. Why does he create this image of this foot that's lacerated, covered in blood? Because this is not what they were told it was going to be like. This is not the great mythical heroic story that they were told when they were kids would happen if they went to war. This is not Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori. He says they were all blind, and he says they were drunk with fatigue. Again, another metaphor. Learn one or two of those metaphors. See everything that's marked in yellow. Pick one or two of them and learn those lines and learn the techniques and talk about how they create vivid images. Okay? Now again, drunk with fatigue. So what did they get? Did they get a bottle of... Billy, yeah? You haven't got any fatigue over there, would you? I'm really thirsty. Oh yeah, here's a bottle of fatigue, yeah, and they drink it. No, he's talking about how addled their brains are. I don't know if you know this, but it's illegal. It's illegal to drive for a long time without getting sleep. As far as I'm aware, it could be 8 hours, it could be less than that. But it's illegal to drive certainly more than 8 hours in a row without getting some sleep. Because the effect that lack of sleep has on you is similar to the effect that alcohol can have on you. It stops your synapses working and it stops you making sharp decisions when you need to. And when you're driving, you need to be able to make sharp decisions quickly. So he's talking about the fact that these men were so tired, they were so fatigued that their brains weren't functioning properly. And what matters is that moment, and don't forget this poem is autobiographical. That moment that happened, he's not making this up, he was there, when they heard this sound, this hoot, and again, hoots, right? That's onomatopoeia. That's the sound that the shell that's fired from the cannon makes as it comes through the air. They were so tired, so exhausted, that their reaction times were slower than they should have been when this shell came in. And he says it was a 5.9, which means a 59 centimeter shell, or in diameter, right? So he's talking about the size of the bullet fired from the cannon. And when he says it was outstripped, he means that the Germans took out the explosive device from the shell, only leaving the detonator, and replaced the explosive device with a poison gas canister. And in the second stanza of the poem, he goes on now to describe what happens and what happened when that canister burst. And these men, these young guys who were only there because they were told by their parents and by their teachers and by their politicians that war is great, war is glorious, go off and be a hero. They're only in this hell on earth because of that. And he describes what happens to one of his friends when he was too slow getting his gas mask on and he breathed in this gas. Brilliant piece of dialogue for drama. Gas, gas, quick boys, you hear that? Gas, gas, that's called repetition. Look at all the things you can say about this poem, okay? Gas, gas, quick boys. So, they have to get the masks on. And ecstasy of fumbling. Brilliant, they're all trying to panic. Where's my mask? Sorry, there's repetition is there. Fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling. And then, if it was me, Ryan, that's a great question. You don't need any. So Ryan just asked the question, how many war poems do we need? You don't need any. You don't need any love poems. You don't need any poems about relationships. In other words, what I'm saying to you is there's no curriculum that says you must study a war poem, you must study a relationship poem, you must study whatever. But my advice to you is this. This is a brilliant poem and it's easy to write about. So it's a war poem, but it's a poem about being young. It's a poem about relationships. It's a poem about trust. It's a poem about betrayal. It's a poem about the harshness and the suffering that can be part of life. So yes, it's a war poem, but it's much more than that. But my advice to you is to have 3 poems prepared that you really understand very well, that you get the story. And the reason I'm talking about it like this is because I want to bring it back to the questions in a minute. Do you get the story and that you understand what the poet does to make the images pop off the page? Now, here's a great line, and it's the best line in the whole poem. And if you're going to learn a line from Dulce at Decorum, learn this line. He says his friend was floundering like a man in fire or lime. Now, sometimes Wilfred Owen died over 100 years ago. But sometimes you just have to go, what a writer. What an amazing writer. Now that is as vivid, when you understand that line, that is as vivid and as troubling an image you're ever going to read. So let me explain to you what the key to this is, that verb floundering. And by the way, see the way he doesn't say floundering, he says floundering, because if he said floundering, there'd be an extra syllable and it wouldn't fit with the meter. Okay? Now, what is a flounder? A flounder is a fish. What happens to a fish when you take it out of water? It flaps around, flops around, and jumps around on the bank. Why does it do that? Because it's drowning, it's dying, it's asphyxiating, it is choking. I can't say the word. It is choking. Now, when he breathes the gas in, it's like somebody has set him on fire. Now, can you imagine if somebody threw petrol at you and then threw a match, up you went like a candle? Can you imagine that degree of pain? When he says lime, he's not talking about somebody throwing a little green fruit at him. He's talking about lime, which is an acid. Like even citrus fruit, if you cut into a lime and a little bit of the juice squirts over it, it'll burn you. Lime is an acid. It has been used to dispose of bodies. It melts the skin. Now, can you imagine if you got lime on your skin and it started to burn through your skin? Can you imagine the kind of pain that you would be in? Can you imagine the kind of pain you would be in if you were on fire? Wouldn't you be flailing around like trying to find a way to stop the pain? Wouldn't you be floundering? And here we have Wilfred Owen describing one of his mates. And he's describing the kind of pain that his friend was in when he breathed in this gas. And he knows that the only reason that young man, who should be off living his life and having a good life, the only reason he's there in that kind of pain is because he was told the old lie, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. He then goes on and he says, dim through the misty pains. Yeah, now enjambment, Liam, absolutely. There's a guy watching this call right now, and his name is Ronan, and we love you, Ronan, right? And Ronan's laughing because he knows that that's my least favourite poetic term, enjambment. I don't like it. If you know what it means, run on lines, talk about that in the rhythm. But I've never, ever seen a question on the junior cycle or the Leaving Cert that required you to talk about enjambment. You can if you want to, but I think similes, metaphors, onomatopoeia, they're your top 3 images to learn. techniques to learn because they create imagery, and imagery is what makes poetry immediate and what immerses us in the world of the poem. They are the key techniques that writers use to draw us imaginatively away from wherever you were in 2025 to a World War I battlefield, looking at a soldier in agony. That's a simile, like a man in fire. And then the poet brings us inside his gas mask. And he says, dim through the misty panes. Misty panes. So why are the panes are the glass of the gas mask? Why are they misty? Because he's breathing inside us, and because he's creating that mist from his breath, and we're inside the gas mask. And thick green light. Why is the light thick? Oh, sorry, why is the light green? Because the gas is green. It's called mustard gas because it burns the back of your throat. If you breathe it in, it causes the blood vessels in the back of your throat to burst. The blood runs down into your lungs and you drown in your own blood. That's what happened to his friend. As under a green sea, another simile. I saw him drowning, and he's not using that as a metaphor. The man was literally drowning. You don't have to be underwater to drown. He's drowning in his own blood. In all my dreams, he says, and this is really important, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me. Guttering, again, onomatopoeia. Choking, onomatopoeia. Repetition of drowning. What vivid imagery that is. And by the way, when he says in all my dreams, he's talking about how he as well, Wilfred Owen, the writer, even though he got his mask on and he didn't breathe the gas in, he's a victim too, because he saw this, he witnessed this, and he has been traumatized. So he's having nightmares about this scene, his friend begging him for help and him not being able to help him. He says, if in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and look at the alliteration, watch the white eyes writhing in his face. To writhe is to squirm in pain. The eyes go white because they're rolled in the back of his head because that's the pain he's in. His hanging face, another simile with a gorgeous example of sibilance, like a devil's sick of sin. And that's one of my favourite lines in the poem as well. I love, that's my number one line, and that's my number two line. Ask yourself, if you were a devil, what's your purpose in life? Why do you exist? Devils exist to sin. That's their whole gig, man. Right? That's if you're a devil, like that's what you do. Well, yeah, I'm a sinner. Yeah, are you a devil? Yeah, you're a sinner. Yeah, okay, cool. Now, if a devil is sick of sinning, a devil is sick of life. And if you're sick of life, you want to die. Look at the line again. He says his friend's hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. He looked into his friend's eyes, his friend who was in absolute agony, choking in his own blood. And what did he know? He knew that his friend wanted to die. This young man who had his whole life in front of him, subjected to this kind of pain. Anything romantic, heroic about this form of death? Yeah, I do have notes on all those things, Kate, and I will be dealing with those things as we go through the weeks. If you could hear at every jolt, the blood come gargling. Again, what is gargling an example of? Onomatopoeia. From the froth corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud. The cud, he's referring to the regurgitated material that cows chew on. Imagine the taste of that in your mouth. Of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. So this is the terrible suffering brought on to innocent young men. And he says, my friend, and he doesn't mean friend. He's talking to those people who told him and his generation those lies. You would not tell with such high zest or energy to children ardent, that means enthusiastic for some desperate glory, the old lie. And what he's doing is he is condemning a condemnation of those who sent a generation to war. And Wilfred Owen died before the war ended. And Wilfred Owen did all of us a service in writing that poem. So forget about your junior cycle, right? There's a value in reading this stuff, because he captured for all eternity, for as long as people can read, as Shakespeare said, so long as men can read, so so long as eyes can, men can read and eyes can see, so long lives this and this gives life to thee. Wilfred Owen wrote this poem, and forever we will understand the horror of a World War I battlefield from reading this poem. Now, let's go back to the wording at the start. Those questions asked about an interesting interaction. Doesn't that show, that poem, an interesting interaction between a human being and modern warfare and the reality of modern warfare? What is your emotional response to that poem? Doesn't that poem cause us to feel horror? Doesn't that poem cause us to feel sympathy for the soldier whose suffering is depicted? Doesn't that poem cause us to feel empathy? That means fellow feeling with those young people who, as young people yourselves, were lied to and then had to suffer such terrible experiences. Isn't that poem filled with a powerful message about trust and about betrayal and about war and about brutality and about believing what you're being told? And doesn't that poem show us the mastery of language and techniques that poets can employ in order to make their experiences come alive for the reader? So, Dulce Decorum Est, I was asked to go through that poem tonight. And hopefully, I've done it to some degree that you understand it a bit better now. And most of all, you understand what Wilfred Owen is doing in that poem to make the imagery powerful. And I'm going to say this one thing to you before I go to those questions, right? If I'm preparing this poem, I'm learning that and explaining that simile. I'm learning that and explaining the simile, and I never mentioned the sibilance, that repetition of the S sound, which gives that line a real memorable quality. And I'm learning these examples of onomatopoeia. Guttering, choking, hoots. I'm learning, and coughing. I'm learning those 4 examples of onomatopoeia, just those words. And I'm going to be able to write a paragraph about how the writer uses onomatopoeia to appeal to the oral sense, to bring the experience of the war more vividly to life, because he doesn't just appeal to one sense, he appeals to the listening sense as well, making our experience of reading the poem more believable and immersive. Now, I've gone over time on that, but I want you to look. Now, don't forget you have this document. I want you to look at what this is, and I will let you go now in a minute. Sorry, I just want to look at what effect is alliteration. So, Rachel, let me just finish this, and I'm going to come to those questions, because that's a great question about alliteration. So, look, is the poet's language effective? That's when you're preparing a poem, the number one thing that you've got to do is be able to explain what happens in the poem. And you saw the questions, there's always the easy question, describe what happens in the poem. But the second thing, and it's a very close second, if you want to do like kind of be able to answer some of the trickier questions, is to be able to talk about the writer's language. And effective means, is the language good? And if you're going to say it's good, you're going to say it's good because the writer creates imagery and he can learn some of these phrases, and integrate them into your answers. That imagery stimulates the imagination. It draws the reader into the world of the poem. It creates a sense of immersion so that we feel as if we're experiencing the event. The language is effective because it appeals to the visual and the oral senses. You can learn that language off, and you're going to be able to use it if they ask questions like the ones I showed you from last year's exam and from the mock exams. When you're talking about imagery, don't say the images are good. Learn that vocabulary that allows you to say it's good without using the word good, because good is ironically bad as an example of vocabulary, and there are loads of other words you can use to describe it. There are examples of similes, metaphor, onomatopoeia, and the precision of language there. And there are phrases that you can learn that will help you explain those quotes and those points in your answers. And finally, because I'm out of time here, there is a couple of sample paragraphs, and if you want me to go through them in class next week, I absolutely will, and show you why they're good. Now, let me just go to this screen, and then I want to talk to you about next week. So, I've read the Spider-Man comment, I've read the Mox comment, I've read the war poems. So ecstasy means a feeling of great intensity. In the poem, Is the word ecstasy in the poem? Where? Oh yeah, I can't see it there. The word ecstasy means a feeling of intense, a heightened emotional state. Enjambment I've dealt with. Weight of Water is a novel that I have a brief note on with key quotes. Same thing with Trash. Much Ado About Nothing. I've kind of just key quotes and breakdowns. But what I'll do is, if you want me to, when I'm doing a drama question, I can do a little sample answer on Much Ado About Nothing to show you how to use it, and the same thing with those. So I won't be teaching you The Outsiders, or teaching you Of Mice and Men, or teaching you Merchant of Venice, but I will be writing sample answers, and I've already written them, and I'll show them to you. Sample answers on a variety of different texts to show you the types of questions that get asked and how to use your text effectively to answer questions. I think the video will be available for you to watch afterwards. Yeah, that's there. Kieran's cooked. So is Charlie. Would it be possible to talk about the poem Strange Fruit? At some stage, I certainly can. No problem. Um the poem that is also a song about lynching in the deep south? If it is, just put that into the chat and I can go through that poem, no problem. I'll come back to that in a second, Susan. Timing, yeah, I do have advice on timing. Okay, so floundering like a man in fire or lime. He's trying to capture the immediate reaction of his friend to the to breathing in the gas, and it's the immediate reaction is to be in agony. So it's like a man in fire. So if somebody set you on fire, would you stand there and go, that's not very nice? Or would you go, right, and be floundering around? That's what the man was doing when he was breathing in the gas, because he was in agony and there's nothing he could do to stop the agony. Lime is as I said, an acid. So if you got acid on your skin, you know all about it. No problem at all. There are loads of sample answers. If you look at the third year book, I'm not sure if you want to. Admin, is the third year book digital book on the platform? Can they have a look through that? Because I know they can access it, the senior ones on the platform, but it should be on the platform for you to leaf through digitally. I'm not going to go back through the first stanza. No, sorry. There's no best 3 poems to learn, Gabby. None. Just pick 3 poems that you like. If you look at the book, I've gone through loads of different poems. Back in the Playground Blues, the Seamus Heaney poems. Yeah, there's any poem that you think is interesting and that you can explain is in terms of language, then there's no right poem to pick. Gonna go over timing now in a second. Yeah, Billie Holiday. Yeah, that's the if that's the poem. If you want me to look at that, I can. Just remind me next week. Yes, the digital book is ready to view. So have a look through the digital book. You'll see loads and loads and loads of sample answers dealing with various different texts. Now, on that topic of timing and the exam, the fact is, and I'll end the class now because there's so much, I've got through so much and I've held you for much longer than I intended to. I apologize. The fact is that you've got 2 hours, so does everybody else. And the fact is that the timing is hard. There are people on this call who I know, and you know me, and you know that all I believe in is hard work. So if you haven't worked really hard on your timing between now and the mocks, you're going to find that difficult. But what I would say to you is, you've got 4 months between now and the exam, and you have loads of time. The answers you write can't be as long as they would be if you were doing your homework. When you look at the exam paper, they'll give you a guideline. If you look at the second page of the paper, they'll tell you advice on timing. See here? Last year's exam, you should spend about 45 minutes on section A, 30 minutes on section B, and 40 minutes on section C. My rough rule of thumb has always been, for the junior cycle, that for every 5 marks available, you've got about 3 minutes. Now, it's really hard to keep to those very specific timings, but what I mean by that is, if you're answering a 20-mark question, then it should take you about 12 minutes to do it. If you're answering a 30-mark question, it should take about 18 minutes. Don't make the mistake of going into the exam and spending ages answering half of the questions and leaving the rest of it blank. Move through the questions as quickly as you can. Concentrate on quality over quantity. Again, I'm not really going to get into mock exams because it is quite close to the mocks now, and I'm really talking about the period of time leading up to the junior cycle. But in terms of if you're doing your mocks next week, just get through the questions as quick as you can. And if you can't write that extra paragraph to answer that particular question because you haven't got the time, so be it, move on. But make sure you answer every question. Now, when they asked to mention techniques and questions, would those three be enough? I think you said symbolizing metaphors and onomatopoeia. They're the ones I would certainly have prepared. Now, there's a million things you can talk about: the meter, you can talk about alliteration, you can talk about the precision of the language, the verb choices. It's up to you. It depends on which poem you're studying and which lines really stand out to you. But you should have an example, 3 quotes prepared that are examples of techniques. And if you have those 3 prepared, it doesn't matter what the techniques are. Okay? Okay, guys, I'm going to have to stop because admin is telling me I'm over time. Is that okay? Did you find that okay? I hope you found it useful. It went a bit fast for me, a bit slow for you, I'm sure. Now, the last thing I'm going to say is this. The reason I did Dulce tonight and didn't do what I was going to do, which was look through last year's paper and show you some unseen material, is because I was asked to do Dulce. I'm delighted to respond. So, if there is a particular thing you'd like me to do in any given week, let me know. You can let me know through the platform. You can send me a message through the platform and say, Paul, do us a favour, do a bit of fiction next week, will you? Or Paul, do us a favour, do a bit of drama next week. Or Paul, can you do an unseen poem? Whatever it is that you want me to do, I'd love to be told by somebody, do this, because then I know that at least one person on the call is getting what they want from the call. So there you go. That's it. Thanks a million. I hope you found it useful. And I'll see you next Thursday. And every Thursday that there's a school week on between now and your junior cycle, I'm going to be here and hopefully you'll make some improvement and we work together to make that improvement. Okay, folks, that's it. Good evening.